Thanks for joining me. I'm trying to marry two topics that are near and dear to my heart. And one is how to talk about cyber in your organization or to other people. And the second one is, once you've done that, how to actually make sure you're well protected and also get cyber insurance. The interesting thing is when I talk about cyber insurance, a lot of people look at me and tell me, oh, you can actually get insurance against cyber attacks. Well, you can't get insurance against the attacks, but you can at least get insurance that helps you manage them once they happen. And that's an interesting topic that we with CyberTalks also look at. So who am I? I have a bit of a weird background, so I'm not the world's best hacker as Cal was before. I was not arrested when I was 12. That's also a good thing, and I'm happy about that. My background is in tech, first of all. So I used to work for Cisco and Intel back in the days as sales engineer and in the engineering functions on the cyber side. And then went much more on the management consulting side of things when I joined McKinsey and worked in their cybersecurity practice, it's called. So the interesting thing for me with that is that I actually have the experience of doing the tech stuff and talking to the tech teams, but also the exposure of actually selling cyber to boards, communicating with boards, communicating with C-level executives on cyber topics, which to me, one of the key realizations was that you have to approach in a very, very different way. Right, so I don't know, we had this question here before, who here thinks they're more on the technical side of things, or more on the ground? Someone who's more on the management or C-level. So I think we have a bit of a spread here, right? So it'd be interesting to also get your input on it. Feel free to call me out if you don't agree as well, please. Contact info's on here. If you want to shout at me on Twitter or email me angry thoughts, that's also fine. I might just ignore them, but we'll see. So, what am I trying to talk about, right? I think overall we can agree that cyber is a risk that all businesses face these days, and over the last few years it's been growing. I have to agree with Cal as well that the threat is probably going to grow in the future, which means you or your company or whoever is looking at it needs to pay more attention to cyber, just because it's a risk to the company. Now, the problem here is that a lot of companies either do not understand that they're at risk, or if they understand it, they do not know how to deal with it. And even if they understand that they are at risk and how to deal with it, a lot of them have a hard time communicating to the people that actually dish out the money. Right? So it goes back to how do you tell your board, your CEO, your CXO, whatever you have there, that you actually need money to protect against cyber. Now, what I found is that there are actually different ways or different things that people care about. Right? So if you think about a board, normally they care about risk and money on a very simple level. So that's something you can easily use to communicate with them. If you go a bit further down the line, if you go to a C-level executive, they also care about money, but they want some more information on what they're actually protecting against. And then if we go down to the technical level, they probably have a better understanding than you do on what they want to protect against. So it's a bit of a game of finding the right level of communicating, right? So what we did in McKinsey and then what I'm still doing now is I tried to break it down into different levels. Right, we're going to start from the top and just have a quick look at all of them. Then I'll wrap it up and we'll look at the technical side at the end. Now, one way that really works well with boards is to give them a big fat number that sums up your cyber risk. Why does that work? Because they understand it. Right? If you tell them, look, I have a £200,000 or depending on the company size, £200 million risk on the cyber side, they understand it, and it's something that they can feed into their standard risk management processes. Because, believe it or not, most of the larger companies, and I'm not talking SME, 10 employee size, but if we talk about mid or larger size organizations, they have standard risk management processes. Right? It's the risk management process of, whatever, our factory burns down, what are we going to do, right? What's the risk? How do we insure against it? How do we protect against it? And cyber, at this point, needs to be fed into the standard risk management processes at a risk level and also at a board level. Right? And what I mean by that is, cyber is now such a big risk to most companies out there that it should be handled like any other risk. Right? In my experience, the best way to do that is to abstract it so far that you basically go and you say, hey, this is the risk I have. It's a number. You understand it. We can talk about it as a number. That's probably the level of technical detail I want to go into with the board. And I see some people smiling. I don't know if that means agreement or not, but at least that's the boards that I've dealt with. It also depends on who's on your board. if you're a Facebook and you have technical people on your board, they're probably not going to get away with that because they're going to ask questions because they think they know cyber better than you do. They might or they might not. Oops, and I managed to click this away. Now, the other great thing about this, looking at it back from an insurance angle, is it actually tells you how much you probably want to insure yourself for, right? Which is something that I've worked a lot with cyber insurance in the past. So you go out there and the insurers basically give you a menu you can choose from on how much insurance you want. Figuring out how much insurance you need for cyber is not an easy task, right? Do you need 100,000, 1 million, 100 million cyber insurance? They're not going to tell you, they're just going to let you choose. And if you underinsure yourself, tough luck. Now, there are some cons to this, right? So one thing is that for the board, if they see a big number, they say like, oh, you know what, we can put £200,000 in a big pot, and if we get hacked, we use that pot and we pay for it, and or everything's going to be fine. It doesn't normally work that way, right? And if it does, well, that's great, but the company might still go bust, right? If you think about BA is not going to go bust, but if you think about, someone did a cross-site scripting attack on the BA website, siphoned off credit card data, probably not something they had as one of their main cyber risks when they assessed this. The other so one of the things that is interesting for me on this, the good thing is it abstracts the complexity of cyber to the board. The bad thing is it also abstracts the complexity of cyber to the board, right? They go in, they think it's easy to solve, right? What's the first thing that happens to this? Oh, we want to lower this risk. How are we going to do it? Well, let's give X amount of pounds to the IT department, because the IT department are the ones that are going to solve our cyber risks. To me, one of the realizations, right, and that goes into how I would communicate to the C-level executive is, it's not necessarily the IT department that solves cyber risks, right? So if we break this down one level further, and this is what I've used before, especially on the C-level executives, is to say, hey, there's actually a cyber risk, right? Yes, it's that number we had before, but it's actually broken down into different components, right? And one of the key realizations, and McKinsey, or while I was still there, we did a study on this, is that on average about 50% of your risk is caused by humans. And I would argue that that's probably part that's getting bigger and bigger. Which means if you go to the board and they say, well, let's increase the IT department's budget by £100,000, they address one half of their cyber risk. The other probably grows or doesn't change. Right? So the advantage of this, basically going one level deeper for the C-level that actually decides where the money goes, is it helps them allocate it to the right resources. And what I mean by right resources, we talked about it with Cal before, and I know some people were there already. It's about, training the employees, phishing training, making sure they understand, we're at a Gdpr conference, they understand how to handle data. And they understand that they probably shouldn't put, health records on a USB stick and leave it on a bus. At least not if it's unencrypted. Probably not even if it's encrypted. Then again, the first thing that happens in any company, and I don't know how many have seen that happen, right? Employees don't want to do cyber stuff. They might be the most IT illiterate people, but they get very IT literate when it goes about circumventing cybersecurity controls. Right? So back in the days, I was never allowed to put anything on a USB stick. So what was the first thing I did is I put a keylogger on my laptop, asked someone to log in as administrator. I had the administrator password. I could log in. I could disable the USB thing. Bam, I had access to my full laptop. Yay. Not encouraging that. Don't do that at home. But that's what happens, right? You have people that figure out, they get incredibly good at figuring out how not to do this. I can't remember where I heard this, but one laptop per child, I don't know if anyone remembers this initiative where they wanted to give out free laptops to kids, right? So after they building their own laptops, they started giving out Android devices to schools in Africa. And it was kids that had never seen a PC before. And there was actually a bug on the device that didn't allow the webcam to work on the devices. And when they got those devices back 6 months later, I think it was 3/4 of the devices had been cracked by the kids that had found legitimate bugs on the Android devices to be able to enable the camera. Right? And that's school kids that had never seen IT before. So think about, semi-literate people in your organization, they'll figure out a way to circumvent it. Right? That's why the training part is incredibly important. And training part, the interesting part in that is, on the human-centric risks, what I would call them is, it's not just accidents that happen. It can also be, purposeful stuff that happens in your organization on the human side, right? So classic example is you have an employee, he's been fired, he or she has been fired, I should probably say, still is employed by the company, still has access to all the data everywhere, they don't have that much incentive to keep that secret anymore. Especially because they're normally the ones that, not the ones that are liable if it's that, surfaces somewhere else, or they might be, but they probably think they're never going to be found. So that's why I say for C-level executives, it might make sense to click one level deeper and say it's not just the number, but there's actually a different breakdown on things that we have to focus on. Right? That works well on a C-level. Probably if you go to CISO with this, he'll nod, but he'll ask you what else is there, right? So once again, one of the cons is it still abstracts the underlying complexity. Now, going into it one step deeper, you get to something that looks horribly complicated. And it is horribly complicated to get to that. The interesting thing with this is it actually gives you all the, I don't want to call it all the information, but at least it gives you a bit of an overview on where you stand on your cyber stuff, right? So what we did is we said, hey, let's break down cyber in some of the major risk categories that we face. And it's small, sorry. Yeah, I know. I was expecting a bigger screen when I was told to present, but it's fine. So basically what we did is we said, hey, let's break this down into the different risk categories that we normally face as a business. Once again, I'm not saying these are always true. There are probably businesses that face very different risks from this, right? So one thing that isn't in here is if you're a government agency or if you're aerospace and defense sector, there's probably one big thing in here that's, foreign government attacking you in a very targeted way. Which happens. My personal argument is you probably can't protect against that. If they have enough resources, they will get in. It's then about seeing what they can breach. But that's a different story. So what we did here is basically break it down to the individual components and said, hey, where do we stand on this, right? Let's run an assessment, and that could be an outside-in assessment where someone comes in and actually looks at it in detail, or it could even be 15 questionnaires. Let's understand where we stand on each of these, rate ourselves, and then compare us against the industry average. There's one thing that I'm not exactly sure how I feel about it. Some people in the cyber industry say, hey, I don't need to be the best. I just need to be better than my next door neighbor. That is true for some attacks. The interesting thing is that a lot of the attacks that we see these days, they're just not targeted. Right? So if they think about all the ransomware attacks that happen, right, NotPetya, WannaCry, I don't think any of those were targeted, right? I don't think anyone planned to actually shut down the NHS. I talked to some F-Secure researchers back in the days. Their theory was that it was actually a beta version developed by North Korea that somehow went rogue. That's why it still had a kill switch in there that you would probably not put in a live version. But once again, different story, happy to discuss it afterwards, right? What this does is, it does, however, give you a good indication on the areas that you have to focus on as an organization. Right, so it tells you, hey, for me, in this example, my biggest risk is probably ransomware and software vulnerabilities. What does that mean for me as an organization? It means I should probably try to protect against those. Right, and there's multiple ways of doing this. Software vulnerabilities, yes, obviously you ensure you patch your systems. Easier said than done. So we did a project, and I see the one person that raised their hands when they said they were technically laughing. It sounds easy, right? Let's patch all systems. And at home, I do it. I patch my laptop whenever Microsoft tells me to patch stuff. Laptop is easy. Now, if you start patching servers, that gets a bit more tricky because you have to make sure that you don't break anything when you patch it, right? And if you patch one server, that's fine, right? It takes you 20 minutes to patch one server. Now, think you're an organization that has 30,000 of those things. And numbers get different. So we did for an Indian telecommunications company an analysis that if they wanted to patch all servers within 2 weeks of getting a patch out for one of their core components, they would have to employ around 3,500 people. Exactly. That's the result we got from them. They laughed at us and said, probably not going to happen. Right? So how do you deal with that? Well, you still try to minimize your risk of software vulnerabilities. That means you patch the stuff that's incredibly urgent, you know it's going to be exploited, you just patch it. Right? The risk of something breaking is lower than you being attacked and that being exploited. So stuff like the Eternal Blue vulnerability that caused WannaCry to happen, that's probably something you just want to patch because you know it's out there, you know it's a bad exploit, and if something breaks in your infrastructure, you can still fix it, but it's unlikely to happen. Other lower risks, maybe you don't patch them. Maybe you figure out, that is there some firewall or is there something that you can put in front of it to make it less likely to be exploited. But that's what this map gives you, right? So the other thing that's interesting about this one is going back to the cyber insurance thing. This actually tells you what to look out for in your insurance policy. The interesting thing, and we can double click on that and then kind of go through the individual risks, is insurance policies cover some things by default, some things that have big asterisks on that say, oh, this is only covered if you do special things, and other things are excluded by default unless you ask for them to be included. So if we just look at the risk categories that I mentioned before, right? So one is data breach. Gdpr conference, I think everyone knows what a data breach is, right? It's someone getting their hands on your data one way or another. It could be by accident, could be on purpose. Doesn't matter, they got access to your data. It doesn't have to be personal identifiable information. It can also be trade secrets, right? So if you're a pharma company, if someone gets your drug recipe, that's probably not a good thing. That's actually an easy one from an insurance side. That's normally included, right? So they make sure that if that happens, they have the breach response in place, they pay for the breach response, they have people on a retainer that they bring in, lawyers, PR agencies. That's pretty easy and well understood. Denial of service attacks, interestingly, still something that people worry about. The place I've seen them the most is with banks. Interestingly enough, for banks, it's less about actually bringing down the bank, but more trying to blackmail people. Right? It's like, oh, I'm going to attack you for 15 minutes because that's what I get on AWS for free. Then I'm going to send you an email and say, ooh, if you don't pay me 2 million euros by tomorrow, or pounds, or whatever it is, I'm going to take your bank down. The bank I worked with, it was a European bank, they got about 15 of those threats a week. They basically just filtered them out, threw them away because they had the right protection in place. They just laughed them off. They had also learned their lesson the hard way because they actually had been down for a week before when they were under a DDoS attack a couple of years ago. Then again, working with other banks, they have nothing in place. You talk to one about DDoS and they go like, oh yeah, DDoS. What is that? So it is a risk that's out there, especially if you're a platform that relies on your online presence. So if you think about Amazon being down for 2 days, right? If you think about the amount of money they would lose, that's quite a significant bit. From an insurance point of view, normally that's something that's also insured, right? If you have a business outage due to a cyber attack, they figure out what your average revenue is for that day, or and they pay you easy. And they also help you fix it, right? So they normally have the right people in place from a technical side that can help you mitigate that, and yada, yada. Where it gets a bit more tricky is something that I would call it e-theft. I think it could also be called phishing or whaling. It's what Kel before talked about. You know, you get an email that says, ooh, I'm the CEO of your company. My email address looks semi-legit. Make sure you pay this customer by tomorrow because it's super urgent. And half the people just pay. And to me, it's always like, well, I probably wouldn't pay this. Why does this work? The interesting thing on the cyber side is these attacks exist because they work, right? So it's a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. All the spam emails I get with people trying to sell me, I don't know, penis enlarging drugs, I don't know who clicks on them, but someone must do it. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a business for it. Same thing with e-theft, right? So this whole thing about CEO fraud or whaling or whatever it's called, it works. And talking to the insurers, this is the biggest claims category they see. Because people just transfer money, right? It's like have 10,000 here, have 10,000 there. The interesting thing is from an insurance point of view, this is normally not included by default in the policy. Right? So you get your cyber insurance policy, you sign it, you're happy. Theft is normally an add-on at quite a hefty charge because they see quite a lot of claims on it. Insider threat, last but not least, sorry, that's your second page. Let me run through this. Insider threat we talked about, that's your disgruntled employee that makes sure, you know, he takes as much data as he can when he leaves or before he leaves. Normally included, protection-wise, it's actually relatively simple, and that is make sure you disable accesses to employees after or before you fire them, and you limit their access to the core company data, right? Sounds easier said than done. If you have set it up correctly, it is possible. The problem is in a lot of companies, it's once you're on the inside, once you have a company laptop, you can access most of the stuff that's on the internet, right? Once again, talking medium-sized businesses, normally in your large banks, they're pretty good at not giving everyone access to everyone's accounts. But in the medium enterprises, it's normally a bit more open, but more trusting. Last three, ransomware, we talked about that quickly, right? The WannaCries of the world. Great stuff, fun tools out there. Once again, I don't know who would fall for this and click on an email that says install this to do whatever or open this random PDF file. People do, right? For better or worse. Once again, normally insured, but once again, insured with a big caveat that is you have backups that we can restore. And that's data restoration costs they cover. If your backup doesn't work, if you've never tested it, if you don't do scenarios for this, the insurance won't help you either get your data back, right? What's gone is gone. Interesting thing about the ransomware software actually is they all claim they can get your data back if you pay $200 in Bitcoins. Some of them actually have such broken implementation of the encryption underlying that they can't get your data back. So it's a one-way encryption. Even if you pay them, they won't give it to you or they can't get it back. GDPR. I'm at a GDPR conference. You can probably tell me more about that than I can. But fines and regulation is something that's increasing. And that's also getting hefty, right? So everyone quotes the 500 million or 2% of global revenues for GDPR, whichever is greater. The interesting thing is we haven't seen any GDPR fines yet, right? So no one knows what's actually going to be happening on this. The other thing is it's not sure if it's insurable these days. So most of the insurance policies have it in there that you're insured against GDPR fines. But then there's another asterisk on there that says as allowed by applicable laws. Normally you can't insure against fines, right? So if you go speeding down the motorway and you get a fine, you can't insure against that by law, because otherwise the fines are kind of useless if you just transfer the risk to someone else. And last but not least, software vulnerabilities. We touched on those a bit before, right? Patching your servers, making sure it's up to date. Once again, insured, yes, with a caveat that they say, you should patch regularly. And it's probably up to a court of law to define what regularly means in that context. Which, once again, as someone taking out insurance, I wouldn't want to run at the risk of saying, I'm going to stop patching because I'm insured, if someone else is going to decide whether that's going to be applicable or not. Right, so much for a quick intro to cyber insurance and a bit of how I would go about reporting about cyber. One thing I like to close with is, if there's 3 things that you should take away from this. One is make sure you target your cyber communications to whoever you're talking to. Right, if you go in there with a radar chart to your board of directors, they're either going to start looking at their phones, or they're going to kick you out of the room and tell you to come back. Right, make sure you have the right level there. Same thing if you go to your CISO tech team with a total number of cyber risks, they're probably also going to kick you out because they don't care. Or they do care, but they want to understand it a bit more. The other interesting thing is understand where your risks lie. Right, so we talked a bit about the cyber risks. The important thing there is it's not just about technology. Right, everyone thinks about cyber and they go like, we can install a new virus scanner. Yay, we fixed it. Equal amount of risks are in your people and in your processes. So make sure you look at that end to end. Right? And last but not least, cyber insurance, great market, great thing to have. Probably going to be necessary to do contracts with US companies pretty soon because they will ask for it. But make sure you understand your wording, you understand what you're covered for, what's expected of you. And with that, thank you. Enjoy your day. See you all soon.